Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Find out more at patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the Greek interpreter interpreted, the Norwood builder built, and the Reigate squires puzzled, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
How many disguises did Sherlock Holmes use? What were the street Arabs? And how did he get information from his underground network?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 355. Was Sherlock Holmes an American? Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae from the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you a full-blooded American?
Well, hold on a minute, I think. Let me do a blood test. Yes, I can tell because I'm A positive.
Excellent. Well, and your blood comes back red. So there you go. Well, this is one of those episodes called Master's Class. We are now in the third quarter of the year. And if you've been following along this season, we've been doing a different author each quarter. We covered Trevor Hall and Edgar Smith and Michael Harrison. And now we are back on this side of the pond with Christopher Morley as our featured author for the remaining three master's classes for this season. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about an essay by Morley called Was Sherlock Holmes an American? And the easy answer is to say no and close the episode. Goodbye, everybody. It's just a trifle. But goodbye. As you can imagine, there's more to it than that.
Yes.
So, let's just do the housekeeping. Show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles355. That's where you can sign up for email updates. Of course, see our Patreon link. You can support us for as little as $1 a month. Patreon supporters get ad-free versions of the show and are all automatically entered for our contests, our raffles, which we do at the end of every month and at the end of every quarter. It makes you eligible for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal and a free annual subscription to the BSJ. So it's a cheap way to be part of some fun here and to support what it is that we do. So we hope that you join in the fun there. And of course, check the show notes for any links that we might have where you can learn more. Okay, so here we are once again, stepping into the master's class. Now, this is interesting because people can find this essay from the 1930s. I think it was written in 1934, originally for the Saturday Review of Literature. You can also find it in the 1940 book by Vincent Starrett, 221B, and in a more recent book, The Standard Doyle Company, Christopher Morley on Sherlock Holmes. It's edited by our pal Steve Rothman. And that is the volume I think we're working out of today, Burt. Anything to set this up before we actually dive into it?
I think just, a word about Morley. We talk about these various authors, these Sherlockian scholars, their backgrounds, very briefly, just to let you locate them, in literature and in the world of Sherlock Holmes. Morley, born in 1890 of English parents. He was a man of letters. He led the founding of the Baker Street Irregulars, unintentionally because he was very fond of clubs. He was a best-selling author. He was a columnist. He was a reviewer. He was a poet. He was a playwright. He even appeared on quiz shows. And here he is with a regular column in a weekly publication, the Saturday Review of Literature. And he chooses over 2 installments of his column in the Saturday Review of Literature to create this essay. He had a regular column called The Bowling Green, and on July 21, and then the next week, in July 28th, 1934, he talked to his readers about this question: was Sherlock Holmes an American? And it's a great example of someone blending his professional responsibilities and his personal interests to do something that he obviously enjoyed, and we hope you're going to enjoy our walk through it.
And if you do enjoy this and you enjoy the stylings of Christopher Morley, we would recommend you to an interview we recently did with Steve Rothman over on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We have a short series there called Legends of the BSJ. And we talked with Steve in episode 272 about Christopher Morley, his life, his contributions to the literature, just the impact of who he was at his time, or in his time, and why his opinions were taken so seriously, or that people paid attention to him. So we'll put a link to that I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere episode in the show notes, and you can check that out. So here we have the essay, Was Sherlock Holmes an American? And Morley opens up with, well, I don't know if it's surprising or not, but he opens to tell us exactly where he's going. He says, a capricious secrecy was always characteristic of Holmes. He concealed from Watson his American connection. Well, that's interesting because we know Holmes concealed his brother from Watson, but to hear Morley in the very second sentence, he concealed from Watson his American connection. That's kind of a bomb he drops right away.
It is a bomb. But I'm so glad you started by looking at these early sentences, because one of the things I did want to point out is how much you get the fingerprint of Morley. If I hadn't told you about his experience and talents and what he did, you can see it all here, because the start of this essay is got some wonderful characteristics. There's a lot going on in the first 6 or 7 sentences. Beautifully condensed, a lot of detail. He gets you immediately into the character of Watson. He demonstrates his canonical knowledge, and he's a great storyteller. But to your point, this bomb sentence here, he's thinking about writing an essay, Was Sherlock Holmes an American? And of course, the first thing you think of when you hear that observation, and you said it earlier, was, well, no, he couldn't have been. But also, if you adopt the premise that he was, well, how could that have been? And so Morley gets right to the answer. To start, he says, well, secrecy was always a characteristic of Holmes. He concealed his American connection, and though Watson must finally have divined it, Watson was also not candid with us because Watson was a British patriot. And he probably found Holmes's French grandmother disconcerting. And to add to this, his friend's American association and sympathy would have been painful. But look at the evidence. Not less than 15 of the published cases, including 3 of the 4 chosen for full-length treatment, involve American characters or scenes. And look how Watson earnestly strove to minimize the appeal of United States landscapes of which Holmes must have told him. The Great Plains of the West were an arid and repulsive desert. Vermissa Valley in Pennsylvania was a gloomy land of black crag and tangled forest. And then Watson quotes the child Lucy in A Study in Scarlet. Say, did God make this country? So here he is, he says, this is all basically, he says, Watson has heard all of this too often in their fireside talks.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Watson is, downplaying in some cases or poking fun at American landscape. This notion of a child thinking God created the country or that Vermissa Valley was so gloomy. I mean, who would ever want to live there? Watson, so rooted in England, even after having seen something of the world with his 3 continents. But Morley goes on and he said, why does Watson write, "It was upon the 4th of March, as I have good reason to remember, that the adventure of the Study in Scarlet began"? Morley says, Holmes was still at the breakfast table. It was the 4th of March, 1881, and Holmes was absorbed in reading the news dispatches about the inauguration to take place that day of President Garfield.
Yeah, it's great. And now you're really into it. He says, so was Holmes actually of American birth? It would explain much. It would explain the jealousy of Scotland Yard, the refusal of knighthood, his expert use of Western argot, his offhand behavior to aristocratic clients, his easy camaraderie with working people of all sorts, the fact that he always traveled first class in trains. And how significant it is that Holmes goes, when he notes that Irene Adler was born in New Jersey. And how careful Watson is inserting USA after every American address, which always irritates us, but who was probably teasing his principal. Well, and then Morley gets into this period where he says, let's light the cherrywood pipe and examine the data more systematically. And he has a section here where he goes into Holmes's grandmother and Vernet, the French artist. And the reason for all of this, and this occupies several paragraphs, is he says, Holmes's grandmother, one of this radical and bohemian and wide-traveling family, brought up among the harrowing scenes of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, may quite possibly have emigrated to America. And it's not completely impossible. It's not inconceivable that one of Holmes's parents could have been an American. My own conjecture, says Morley, is that there was some distant connection with the famous Holmes household of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Every reader has noticed Holmes's passionate interest in breakfasts. Does this not suggest the autocrat of the breakfast table? Well, of course, this is a reference to Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting side note, and we're nearly 100 years away, 90 some odd years away from when Morley first wrote this, but. The Autocrat at the Breakfast Table was essentially a set of essays that Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. wrote that was responsible for the launch of the Atlantic Monthly in the 1850s. They were later turned into a book form, and Wendell Holmes followed these with, I think, the physician at the breakfast table and the poet at the breakfast table in the ensuing decades following the 1850s. So it was something that would have been widely known to Morley's audience in the 1930s.
Yes. Yeah, an absolute figure. Oliver Wendell Holmes, multi-continental figure of literary and other interest.
But interesting that he should make the connection between the English Holmes and the American Holmes.
Yes, absolutely. Well, then we have a passage when Morley speculates on what Holmes was doing between the time he left university and is taking rooms in Montague Street. And the reason he does this, he says, well, if we look at the chronology when Holmes might have left university, and the time that he took rooms in Montague Street when he came to London, I think that he was probably in that interval at the opening of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in 1876. Probably because the extraordinary and informal opportunities offered there for graduate study must have been very, very tempting. And then Morley's got, a number of facts here. But the issue here, of course, is this is Christopher Morley remembering his own childhood, because he grew up in Baltimore, and says, that's probably where Holmes acquired his tastes for oysters, which, of course, we hear about in The Sign of Four. And on a hot summer day, he noted the depth to which the parsley had sunk in the butter. Which comes, from the adventure from the Six Napoleons.
And we should also mention in this essay, a few sentences further back, he mentioned the many colors of Holmes's dressing gown, blue, purple, or mouse-colored. And then in a footnote, he says, elementary, this particular gown was blue when new, man with the twisted lip. It had gone purple by the time of the Blue Carbuncle, and during the long absence, 1891 to 94, when Mrs. Hudson faithfully aired and sunned it in the backyard, it faded to mouse and the empty house. So just this aside here, in this wonderful essay, we have what has eventually become the official color for the Baker Street Irregulars ties and rosettes and all the rest of the merch that they do. And has become widely accepted as the explanation of Holmes's 3 dressing gowns.
Well, this is just, and then Christopher Morley gives us a lovely exposition. He's got Holmes now in Baltimore, and says, describes how happy he must have been in that environment, and then says, he probably went to the Great Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And, of course, that must have been where he met Wilson Hargreave, who became important in the New York City Police Department, because that was mentioned in The Dancing Man, Wilson Hargreave. He has a record in his case of Vanderbilt and the Yeggman, and we hear about that in Sussex Vampire. There's another case. He went to Chicago, where he made his first acquaintance with organized gangsters, because in The Dancing Men and in The Valley of Fear and in The Three Garridebs, and these are all in footnotes to your point, Holmes talks about his knowledge of the crooks of Chicago, so he must have been there. And then he says he must have gone to Topeka, because he knows from The Three Garridebs that there is no such person as Dr. Lysander Starr.
Now, see, that's a little silly. I got to call an audible here. He could have made up any name from Topeka, whether or not he knew there was a real person like that, and called the bluff of Killer Evans.
Well, I suppose so, yeah. And then he has another reference here, not to Oliver Wendell Holmes, but to Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was then rising lawyer in Boston. That's probably where, says Morley, Holmes heard firsthand stories of the Civil War, which fired his interest. And he spoke to Watson. Holmes spoke to Watson so often about the Civil War that Watson repeated the story of the resident patient. In The Resident Patient, he repeats the episode of the Henry Ward Beecher portrait, which he'd already told in the cardboard box. And so here, now we know from previous scholarship and discussion exactly why that passage was repeated in 2 stories. But here Morley says, well, it's just Watson repeating something he's heard often in his discussions with Holmes.
Yeah, and then he draws another connection to Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, with a few months after the cardboard box, the Strand reprinted printed a chapter on ears in October, November 1893, with photos of ears of famous people, including an ear of Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes. This intimate permission could not have been without the privileged intervention of Sherlock, writes Morley.
Right. Dear Oliver Wendell Holmes, might we trouble you for a photograph of your ears? For my friend George Nunes in the Strand magazine. Maybe not too likely.
Take one picture if convenient, take two if inconvenient. All the same.
Yeah, well, then, and speaking of pictures, we have another lovely departure here. And, of course, that's one of the reasons why this essay is so entertaining. He's got such knowledge. I mean, just look at the canonical references, these mentions of Chicago in the various stories, people like Wilson Hargreave. We have all of this beautifully presented in the essay. But now we have a little departure where Morley observes, I wonder why nobody's paying more attention to the information that exists in Sidney Paget's illustrations. People, he says, have wondered about Holmes's university for years and years. Which university did he go to? It's perfectly clear because there's a drawing by Sidney Paget in the Strand magazine that shows Holmes wearing the Cambridge ribbon, a light blue ribbon on his straw hat. Well, first of all, and last of all, it's a black and white drawing. So
it looks green to me. The ribbon looks green to me.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. Yeah. So there you are. But anyway, that's a Paget illustration from the Gloria Scott where Holmes is sitting in Trevor's garden. Holmes, and Morley says, wearing a straw hat with a light blue ribbon.
Well, clearly, Morley is stretching things here to support his thesis. And, they're not out of the question, but they are fanciful in nature. So, well, this is probably an opportune time for us to fancy ourselves a little chat with our sponsor. So stick with us. We're now in the fourth quarter of the year, and the Baker Street Journal is going as strong as ever under editor Dan Andriacco. We've just seen the cover for the autumn issue, and it is a doozy. Full-color rendering of Professor Moriarty's head and shoulders from Sidney Paget's famous illustration. Now, that's not to say the professor had dandruff. Far from it with his bald pate. But we see the details of Paget's genius close up. And that's what the Baker Street Journal allows us to do with all kinds of scholarship and creative writing. To focus on the details of some aspect or another of Sherlock Holmes and his world. Just like we do here on Trifles. If you haven't gotten a subscription for 2023, it's not too late. You can still subscribe, get all of the issues to date, and be signed up for the Christmas annual. Just go to bakerstreetirregulars.com and subscribe to the BSJ today. Okay, we are back. We're exploring with Christopher Morley the question of Sherlock Holmes's Americanism. Was he an American? And Morley kind of takes a turn at this point and goes from these mentions of places and instances and whatnot, and starts to look at the criminal side of the canon.
Yes, and takes us through all of the American references, points out that the very first case recorded by Watson was the murder of Enoch Drebber, the ex-Mormon from Cleveland. Reminds us again that Irene Adler, the woman, was a native of New Jersey. That in the Red-Headed League, we are told about Ezekiah Hopkins of Lebanon, Pennsylvania. In the Five Orange Pips, Elias Openshaw emigrated to Florida. We have John Douglas, Aloysius Doran, and John Douglas, who struck it rich in California. Senator Neil Gibson, the Gold King. And then, of course, we have some really apt references here about American slang, which Holmes praises from time to time. He quotes Thoreau. He shows his knowledge of the price of cocktails. And, of course, he utters this famous sentiment, "It's always a joy to meet an American, for I am one of those who believe that the folly of a monarch and the blundering of a minister in far gone years will not prevent our children from being someday citizens of the same worldwide country, under a flag which shall be a quartering of the Union Jack with the stars and stripes.
That's I've always loved that passage, and it makes me wonder, is this something that a true Englishman would say? Looking for a resolution of an acrimonious breakup that occurred a century before. Or is it something that an American would utter in the hopes of patching things up? The jilted lover versus the one who was doing the jilting. It's an interesting perspective, a dichotomy of views there as to who would actually be wishing for the quartering of the two flags.
Oh, it's a very good point. And that reference, of course, comes from The Noble Bachelor. Well, and now we are sort of headed for the exits because this essay did take up, as we pointed out earlier, 2 weeks in the Saturday Review, and we don't want, if we went through it paragraph by paragraph with you to point out all the delightful things, we would be talking to you for 2 weeks. But Morley heads to the exits here. He says that Holmes was reared in the States or had some schooling here before going up to Cambridge seems then at least arguable. His complete silence on the subject of his parents suggests that they were deceased or not in England. A foreign schooling would explain why he was so solitary at college. If he'd gone to almost any English school, the rugger jargon of Cyril Overton, and you remember in The Missing Three-Quarter, Holmes can't understand the compressed speech of Cyril Overton about the team and the issues there. It seems very foreign to him. But Morley says, well, if he'd been to an English school, that wouldn't have been the case. And then says, Watson, if he knew more about Holmes's family, might have just been moved by jealousy to keep silent, because there was a big contrast between the corpulent and successful Mycroft and his own older brother, the very unfortunate H.W., that Holmes earlier correctly identified as someone who'd fallen down in the world. Or it could have just been absent-mindedness or inaccuracy, because we know that characterizes Watson. And it seems that has leached over to Watson's wife, who went so far as to forget her husband's first name and to call him James in front of a visitor.
Or to Watson forgetting that Professor Moriarty's first name was James, and so was one of his brothers. So, interesting calling out of Watson's inaccuracy. But I love the way Morley leaves it. He quotes an American, Jefferson Hope, who said, "I guessed what puzzled the New Yorkers would puzzle the Londoners." And Morley says, so I leave it as a puzzle, not as a proven case for more accomplished students to re-examine.
But the master's own dictum, Morley says, is apposite. When once your point of view is changed, the very thing which was so damning becomes a clue to the truth.
So, where do you come down on all this, Bert?
I personally do not buy, and clearly at the end of it, Morley chose to leave it up to the reader. I personally don't buy that Sherlock Holmes was an American. But here you have in this, magnificent essay, the seemingly effortless presentation of deep knowledge of literary figures, of storytelling, of the characters of Holmes and Watson, of the canon, of the observations, of the characters, just effortlessly tossed off by a really talented writer. And it's one of the reasons why spending some time every once in a while and looking back on these essays is, I think, so worthwhile.
And it's certainly anything but a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
This letter which started your wife's torment. You are quite certain that it was from the United States?
Yeah, the postmark was Chicago.